In this video, we're going to continue learning about weak verbs. Verbs that have weak letters as a part of their root. And this video is about pay noon verbs, or verbs that begin, their first root letter is a noon. Well, it's actually not unique. One interesting aspect of the Hebrew language is that any word that begins with noon, it seems like, but specifically verbs, that noon will disappear. It'll just sort of fall off of the verb if there are other letters that come around it. So what the noon does not appreciate is being surrounded. I like to think of the noon as being claustrophobic. So if it's sort of hanging on an end all by itself, you know, with some space on one side and then adjacent to a letter on the other side, it's okay. But if it gets flanked by consonants, it gets nervous and it rolls up into a little ball and usually gets eaten by the next letter. So what we call the noon when this happens is we call it an assimilated noon. An assimilated noon. I'm not sure I've spelled that correctly, but assimilated noon. So this happens when the noon gets couched between two other words or two other letters. So for instance, if we have the word nafal, which is in some ways it's a homonym in English with the word fall. Nafal, to fall. In the pa'al, it's to fall. So if we put this into an imperfect form, which requires the addition of a prefix on the beginning, say we use the yod, so it's third masculine singular. So what it would generally be is yin pol, right? That's the imperfect vocal pattern for the pa'al. And this dagesh here would be a dagesh lene following a closed syllable. Well, the noon doesn't like this, right? It gets that claustrophobic, and so what happens is that the noon rolls up into a little ball and gets munched by the pay, which is actually kind of appropriate because pay means mouth. So now you get a dagesh forte in the pay, which is the doubling dagesh. So now you have ye pol. Okay, the actual vocal pattern remains the same, but the noon disappears, and its sign, or its the clue that it leaves to its former presence in the word is this dagesh forte. And that's what the noon will do. The noon will assimilate into the following root letter as a dagesh forte, if the letter can take a dagesh forte, which is to say, if it is not one of the guttural letters, because guttural letters cannot be doubled. So the interesting thing about the noon, and really about the sound n, is that actually assimilation is the perfect metaphor for what happens with the noon. In a number of different languages, including English, there is an exact replica of this I don't know, what do you call it, experience in English. So the word illegal. If you go to the root is in legal or legalis or something like that. I actually don't know Latin, so I'm going a little bit outside of my expertise here. But the root here is in. I know that much. Not. And so what happens when these two become one word, the N becomes the next letter. It assimilates into the next letter, and then there's two of them. Illegal. And it does so because the N sound, is a very weak, somewhat passive sound. And it's also in a location in the mouth that is similar to a bunch of other sounds that the mouth creates. So and ol are similar action of the tongue, just sort of the lips do something different. Ol. Actually, the lips don't do anything different, but it's just a sort of different orientation of the tongue, but it's in the same place. Or and or and buh, or and I don't know, whatever. So the N assimilates in English, and it also, the noon, then assimilates in Hebrew. And so the main thing that you want to remember is that the noon will disappear if anything is added on either the beginning, if it's the first root letter, or in some cases you'll have a noon as a final root letter, and then in the affix form, when the affix is attached, or perhaps a prefix complement, then the noon will fall off on the end as well. Although if it falls off the end, it will still leave a doubling dagesh. So look for that dagesh forte. But particularly with pay noon verbs, the dagesh forte in what will be the second root letter, but the first visible root letter, that's going to be your sign. And if, for instance, here in this example, in naga, if the noon disappears with the addition of a prefix, the noon disappears, and it wants to go into, oh no, I'm sorry, it can do it in this one. I don't have an example up here of a verb that has a middle root letter as a guttural. But if you have one, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but let's just say the verb is noon, hey, lamed. Okay? If you add a prefix and this noon disappears, it wants to go into the hey as a dagesh, but it can't. So what happens is called compensatory lengthening. That instead of the dagesh going in the hey, our prefix vowel is a hirik in the pa'al, it will go back to the hirik and sit next to it. So the dagesh will not enter the hey because it's a guttural. It will reject the dagesh, and it goes back and lengthens the hirik to its sere. That's what will happen.